It's 90s week on WandaVision. Ooh, I hope Blues Traveler shows up. Hello everybody and welcome to my review of this week's episode of WandaVision, which was a bit of a breather after last week's big explosive reveal, or non-reveal, depending on who you listen to. I was very interested to hear how many different theories there were about the reveal from last week's episode. As we've been doing before, I'm just going to jump right into the spoilers because this show at this point is so deep into so many different plot things that I can't guarantee non-spoilers to really discuss anything. So let this be your blanket spoiler warning. I will be going into details not only about this week's episode of WandaVision, but the big reveals that happened on last week's episode of WandaVision. So if you don't want to be spoiled, tune out of everything that has any kind of electronical signal, but especially this review, because we're about to go deep into WandaVision. Last week, they left us with quite a cliffhanger. Evan Peters showed up as Pietro, and the question was, is he the Quicksilver from the X-Men universe pulled over into the MCU as we know it? I still think that he is. Others think differently. We're going to find out. But we are definitely jumping ahead to the 1990s and the sitcom world of WandaVision. And they continue to get this stylistic thing just right because from the very beginning, the alt text, the first-person camcorder, the shift in perspective to the kids, which I think is not just a clever thing for the sitcom parts of the show, but for the actual show, because it's starting to look more and more like these kids, or maybe at least one of them, knows a little bit more about what's going on, maybe even more than his mom, but we'll get to that. They are really, though, they're nailing even how these things were shot, the tone, the tempo of it, the direct-to-camera stuff, the cutaways to the flashbacks. You can tell that there are a lot of students of the sitcom art form making this show, and we start with the first few minutes that are kind of in this, but what I liked is that they're using this familiar thing of using the sitcom tropes, but now we see, because we've been with the show for several weeks now, things like Vision sort of understanding that he, last week was about him understanding that something weird's going on. This week is about him trying to pass himself off as being totally cool with what's happening. He makes the little remark about when he comes down in his Vision Halloween costume about there not being anything else in his closet, but then he immediately goes back into sitcom dad. He's learning. He's a learning robot, although he's not even really a robot. It's just a fun thing to say. I love everyone in the throwback costumes. Of course, Wanda wearing the old school Scarlet Witch costume. We had Pietro and the old school Quicksilver getup, Vision as Vision, of course. And then we get to Billy. And Billy, I think, and I was trying to confirm, it looked to me like he was dressed as Doctor Strange. Maybe, it wasn't spot on. It didn't have the Eye of Agamotto. He had a headband. Doctor Strange doesn't have a headband, at least not in the movies, the MCU as we know it. But the red cape and everything tied around, to my mind, I thought he was dressed as Doctor Strange, which makes sense considering that Wanda is supposedly going to be crossing over somehow into Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. But this was a very forward thing, so maybe that wasn't Doctor Strange. Maybe that's not what that costume was supposed to be, but that's what I took it as. And it's another thing that kind of shows that the two realities that we're seeing are slowly starting to merge and collapse into each other. We also get the first of a few different exchanges between Wanda and Pietro, which seems to indicate that they have very different memories. They talk about the Halloween when they were a kid, and this is one of those things where they use the trope of the swipe over to the old memory and coming back, and Wanda says, well, that's not how I remember it. And then Pietro says, oh, well, you probably repressed the grief. And that's what I like, too, is they kind of breeze over those moments and they don't break that sitcom thing. The music is still there, but it's the little things now that are starting to pop through. So then Vision, who is obviously up to something, says he's going to go out on neighborhood watch detail, and he leaves the kids alone with Wanda and Uncle Pietro to go trick-or-treating for Halloween. Then we step outside of the Hex briefly, where Hayward is still recovering from Wanda getting all of his soldiers to turn his own guns on him last week. And we see this continued conflict between Rambo and Hayward, where Rambo is trying to stick up for Scarlet Witch, is sticking up for Wanda, saying, like, why did you send weaponry in there to get her? And we get a little bit more of what Hayward's real motivations are, because he says, listen, why are you sticking up for these super people? Do you know what they did to the world? You don't, because you were gone. The rest of us were here, and we had to deal with it. You don't know what it was like. This is what I like about interweaving other elements of the MCU, because this was a big theme in Avengers Endgame, of course, and perhaps if time had continued to go on without whatever's going on plucking the Infinity Stone out of our timeline, we could have seen this would have been addressed perhaps earlier, but this is the most that we're getting. There were jokes about it. It was a plot point in Spider-Man Far From Home. But this show is also driving home the realities of half the world's population being gone for 5 years and the other half being there. And we see where this butts heads. We get a Captain Marvel name drop. But what it really comes down to is that Hayward doesn't like that Monica is standing up for these superpowered people because he doesn't believe that she's had to really live the ramifications of what they can do. And I think that's going to play into some information that we learn about later on in this episode. Basically, this argument ends up with Wu, Darcy, and Monica all getting booted and ejected from the base, but because Randall Park apparently can do close-up magic and fight, they escape captivity and live to hack in a few minutes. Then we go back into the Hex. We have a little bit more discussion between Wanda and Pietro about why things are the way they are. And then there was a really interesting moment that I think can really spin us off into some very gonzo things because they're all out trick-or-treating. It's Halloween. The whole neighborhood is out. And Pietro and the kids decide to run off and cause some Halloween mischief. And the word kick-ass is spoken as they run away. And then Wanda, they make a point of Wanda stopping and saying kick-ass. Now, perhaps this is just a clever nod to the people at home. That's what some people think the casting of Evan Peters is. It's a bit of a tip of the cap to the fans for the whole recasting thing. I think it goes deeper than that. And taking this moment to specifically say kick-ass is played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, who is the actor who also plays Pietro, the version of Quicksilver that was killed in Age of Ultron that doesn't show up. Instead, we got Evan Peters' version. Wanda seems to be kind of tossing that name around as if she knows it or it's familiar in some way. This is a multiverse, and in the multiverse, our Earth, the Earth that we ourselves live in, the Earth that has a Marvel Cinematic Universe and an actor named Aaron Taylor Johnson, we are one of those multiverses. So is this a tiny little hint that Wanda is picking up on these different vibes from all of the multiverses and that the words kick-ass resonate in her mind just a little bit because it is an actor who played the character of her brother in a different movie, even though in her reality, that movie is reality. I know I'm spinning off, maybe it's the 3 a.m. of it all. I'm spinning off into some crazy things here, but with this show in particular, I don't think that anything you see is there by accident. And so this is something that I'm going to be very interested to follow up on because they're dropping all of these little hints for us to pick up on which ones are going to be dead ends, which ones are going to be false leads. We will find out, and I'm really excited to take that journey. Then we get a legitimately super creepy scene because we find out that Vision, his whole neighborhood watch thing, he's definitely out there watching the neighborhood, but what he's really trying to do is find the border of town, and he gets into the edge of town, and he finds a group of people, but they are not exactly celebrating Halloween the same way that everybody else is. As a matter of fact, they're only minimally moving. They're doing these repeat motions. One of the women who's hanging up a ghost is just silently crying. It is a super creepy sequence. And again, they kept that sitcom-y music laying in underneath. They didn't quite turn all the way into quasi-horror here to show that this was still part of the sitcom world. But I think it's establishing that Wanda does have control over some people, but exercises that control. And again, is it something where this is her choice, or the fact that she has limited powers, and considering what's going to happen later in this episode, is this going to be even more consequential as we go on? And it was just final confirmation for Vision that something is seriously wrong in Westview. Then we cut to one of the commercials, and this one was the most difficult to parse of all the other ones. The other ones had very kind of straightforward ties to the MCU with Strucker and Stark, etc. This commercial was for a yogurt called Yo Magic. It was in the very 90s style, a stop-motion animation. A shark jumps on an island and gives this starving kid a cup of yogurt called Yo Magic that's supposed to sustain him. But then the kid can't open the cup, and we see him slowly wither away and then become a skeleton and essentially starve to death. And then the big high energy kicks in again, and we hear the sales pitch for Yo Magic, which is marketed as the snack for survivors. What does this mean? Is the little kid Vision who can't access Wanda's magic? Is this something that's foretelling what's going to happen near the end of this episode? Is this about the citizens of Westview, the fact that they are destined to wither away as they cannot access the heart of the magic that Wanda is using to do what she's doing to this town? I like that this one is a little more out there, a little more open to interpretation. And again, especially following the scene that we just saw, very genuinely creepy, very accurate to the era, but also very appropriate for this show. And they're really nailing these things as we get later into the season. Back inside the Hex, we get another discussion between Wanda and Pietro, and that's what a lot of this episode was about. It was about establishing their rapport with each other, and I think establishing the boundaries of what they know and what they don't know. Pietro literally just says, I'm here to do my part. I'm here to give you some grief. That's what you wanted, right? He is aware, maybe more so than anybody else, that because he's an outsider, that something very odd is going on in this town. But Pietro still doesn't exactly know what he's doing there. He retains some form of memory from his former self. He says he remembers getting shot on the street for no reason, and then just remembers that Wanda needed him, that she called for him, and then he showed up. So he is very knowledgeable in some ways, and very curious and not knowledgeable in other ways, much like we have seen from Wanda. And they're still, I think, both really waiting to put their full hand on the deck, to really show all their cards and compare notes. I think next week is when we are going to reach that critical mass. Meanwhile, outside the Hex, Wu and Monica and Darcy are holed up, and Darcy's hacking into Hayward's personal information to see if she can figure out just what's going on. And we get a couple of little drops here. Number one, Rambo says that she can now get back into the Hex because she's heard from her aerospace engineer. That was the person that she contacted last week. Lots of speculation. She says she needs to meet my guy on the other side of the ridge or the other side of the field. There was a lot of speculation. This is what I love about this show, is people go deep into like the nitty gritty of the clues. People were using like the Spanish language subtitles and saying, well, that was a feminine noun, so they think it's a female and not a male. But here, Monica says that she's going to go see her guy. Is that just an interchangeable thing? We still don't know who this aerospace engineer is, although at the end of this episode, they're on their way literally to meet him. So it seems like we might figure out who he or she is next week. These kind of mysteries I don't mind, as long as it doesn't feel like they're artificially prolonging it, which it doesn't feel like to me. We also learned that Monica's time in the Hex, both by passing into and out of that barrier, it has changed her on, as Darcy says, it's changed her on a cellular and a molecular level, and that she can't go back in. But Monica basically says, and I think that there could be some debate here, she says, well, I've seen enough medical scans to last a lifetime, being in remission and metastasizing. I think that she's referring to her mother's cancer. Some people may say, well, perhaps Monica herself has cancer or has had cancer. I'm sure we'll find out about that later. Either way, she says, I don't care. I've lived and seen too much to just avoid life. We're going full speed ahead. So Wu and Monica decide to leave and go meet the engineer. Darcy decides to stay behind and continue to find some information, as she does find information on some sort of a weapon system called Cataracts. It was important enough for her to email it to Wu. We don't know what Cataract is, but again, this is going to be the 3 a.m. of it all. When you look at what an actual cataract is, what does it do? It obstructs your vision. It takes away your vision. So Hayward has some kind of a weapons program named after something that obstructs or takes away your vision. He's been tracking Vision and trying to figure out who or what he is, how he's been revived. He didn't seem that concerned about saving Vision at the end of this episode, and we've seen some real antipathy on his part towards superpowered people because he feels like he was left holding the bag for the consequences of their actions. It's kind of a follow-up on Civil War and what happened in Lagos and the Sokovia Accords and everything else. I think that Hayward is trying to either destroy Vision or co-opt Vision to use him to destroy other superpowered people to essentially fulfill Vision's original programming, what he was meant to do when Ultron was building him, which is to protect humanity. I think Hayward may be trying to advance Ultron's vision, either to kill him for good or to use him as a tool to monitor and control, to make sure that nothing like what happened with Thanos happens again. That is a lot to spin off of just one word. And again, we're going to find out so much more about this in the weeks ahead. But these are the fun little webs that the show is weaving. And when people ask about, the fact that I wasn't patient with the first couple episodes, and I was. I was. The third one, I did say made some great advances, and I think that the show's gotten better. But this is what I like, is that every episode now is leaving you with these little threads to follow. And I, when you go back at the end of this, when we look back at the whole thing in total, it may be that those first couple episodes don't seem as jarring, but you can really only judge a show in real time as you go. I try to keep a perspective on what might be coming down the road, but there has not been an episode of the show really since the second one that has left me unsatisfied, dissatisfied in any way. As a matter of fact, I think it's getting more interesting and more intriguing as it's going, and this was no different. By the way, for the Easter egg hunters, I don't do a whole lot of gunting if you're a Ready Player One reader, egg hunting, but there was one thing I noticed when Darcy was emailing James Wu. There were a couple of other email addresses that popped up, and one of those was James Alexander. So I did do a Google search on that. It turns out that's a VFX producer in the MCU. So one of those things where probably he or one of his guys decided, oh, it'll be funny, let's put in my boss's name. Unless there is another superhero that's going to share that name coming up. The other name that popped up, I didn't really find anything on, but it looks like that may have just been kind of an in-joke between coworkers. And hey, listen, if I'm a VFX producer and I inspire like 100,000 people to Google my name at 3 o'clock in the morning, I think that's kind of funny. I hope he has a good sense of humor about it. Back in the Hex, Vision spots a car at the very edge of town, and what do you know? It's Agnes. A lot of people have speculated that it could be Agnes who is behind all of this. There have been many, many people who've said, like last week when it was said that, oh, she's got us all under control, that they never said Wanda, or what if it's Agnes? I have to say, if Agnes is in control of everything, she's also a wonderful actor, because Vision, much like he did last week, snaps her out of her phase, and she basically says, oh my god, you're Vision, you're an Avenger. Vision doesn't know what the Avengers are, which again even further confirms that he has very little to no knowledge of exactly what his life ever is or was, other than living with Wanda in this sitcom world. And then she tells him flat out, you're dead. You're dead, Vision. What are you doing here? So obviously, this is a very disturbing thing for Vision to find out. Then she's just kind of losing it and says all is lost. Vision snaps her back into the WandaVision reality. And I loved that turn from Catherine Hahn, from this just distress, this bottomless pit of despair, to okie dokie neighbor, and driving away. It could very well be that Agnes is behind all of this still. And this was just a red herring to throw us off of the path. Either way, this is a great performance by Catherine Hahn, and I'm glad that she's been great in the kind of broad comedy stuff that she's been doing, but I love that she got this scene, which allowed her to also be one of these people that is seemingly under Wanda's control. Is she? Is she not? Again, something we're going to find out in the weeks to come. As Vision decides to pass the boundaries of Ellis Avenue towards the end of the Hex, we go into the town square where the Halloween carnival is in full speed. And this was something that I like. It was a little tiny setup, a little piece, a question that Vision had asked last week about where the children are, that I love the answer, or the seeming answer to this, which is that Pietro, who again is showing a lot of knowledge about what's really going on, is complimenting Wanda and says, it's really great of you that you only bring the kids out for the holidays, or special guest appearances, because you should spare them the horror of this. What have you been doing to them? Are they sleeping at home? Are they in their beds? By the way, you've been doing great with everybody else. You've kept everyone together. They have great jobs. So he's been looking around, and he knows that this is all. He's in awe of it. He said, I think you're doing great. But this idea that Wanda has been keeping the kids unconscious to spare them the horror of having their mind controlled and being out of their actions, that seems to be the case with everyone else. It seems like everyone who's under the mind control knows that they're under mind control, and they have no say in what they're saying or doing. They're trapped. They're locked inside their own bodies. This is going very much down a very disturbing horror route, especially when you go back to where we started to where we are now. And it's these little touches that I like. The idea of the kids. You're right. The kids do only show up when you need them. And it would make sense if Wanda's a compassionate person to spare them the horror of this as much as she can to maintain normality. Then we get another dead person cameo, much like she saw dead Vision a couple weeks ago. Now Wanda sees dead Pietro with the bullet holes, the same gray face, the blank eyes. That they keep doing this to us. Don't they know? Some of us watch this stuff before we go to bed. This is another very disturbing vision, no pun intended, and also something that brings up an interesting thing, which is that if Pietro is truly something brought in entirely from the outside, then how is this being manifested so that Wanda sees this? Is this something only she can see? Is this what happens when you bring something outside Vision's body with something from the outside? Pietro is some form of something from the outside. Is this a warning? Add it to the list. We'll see what happens. But things are really going down at the edge of the Hex, because Vision has decided he's getting out. He wants to see what is out there, so he attempts to leave this world, and things go very badly for him. He starts to disintegrate, pieces of him start flying off, and we see the kids, the twins' powers. We've already seen in the episode that the twins are starting to manifest powers. Tommy has super speed, so he's a lot like his Uncle Pietro. Billy seems to be a little bit more like his mom because he senses what's happening to Vision, what's happening to his dad, and warns her. He says, I see soldiers. He thinks that he's dying. Something bad is happening. He can see it in his mind's eye. Pietro decides to make a very ill-timed joke. Wanda blasts him across the county fair and then freezes the simulation. It's a very Truman Show type moment where everything stops. And this is where things get very interesting because when I saw her freeze everything, I thought, uh-oh, those soldiers are in trouble because Wanda is coming to get them. Instead, the Hex is coming to get them because the world starts to expand. All of a sudden, everybody that was on the border of the Hex is now being included into the Hex. That means that Vision's decaying body is now restored and laying on the grass, but it also means that a lot of the agents are now inside and their equipment. We see federal agents turning into clowns. I'm sure we're going to see this as a gift to be memed and used as I speak. All of the equipment and stuff, everything is turned into circus equipment, and there are very few people that escape. First of all, Darcy gets sucked into that Hex, so we'll see what happens to her next week. Hopefully she could avoid some of those bad side effects that she was warning Monica about earlier in this episode. Hayward escapes with a couple of aides. Wu and Monica escape, and that's pretty much it. The entire operation has now been brought into the Hex, and the last scene that we see is this rapidly growing distortion field. It looks like Wanda may have stopped the growth at the very end of the show. We see her open her eyes back up, but things are rapidly getting out of control for her. She's losing control of things inside and outside of what's going on. I think that we're building towards something big. Perhaps it is the direct connection to Doctor Strange. Perhaps it is just going to put us on the road that takes us to Doctor Strange. But things are escalating in a very big way. We don't have that many more episodes left to wrap this up, but I think the mysteries are deepening. I'm curious to see what Vision is going to remember at the end of this. The whole sitcom thing, I don't know how much more is left in it because pretty much all of the characters that would really participate in it know what's going on at this point. So we are entering, I think, the end of Act 2, if you're going to break this whole thing into a 3-act structure, and I think we are now officially moving into Act 3. I can't wait to see how far the Hex is expanding, what that sphere of influence is going to be, what is Darcy's role going to be. So many questions for next week. I'm giddy. I'm anxious now for this show. I am ready for it every week because the storytelling and the performances, the effects, everything have been so great so far, and it's just getting more compelling. It is setting up for a big ending, and the more that you kind of build up towards a great ending, the more you could potentially let people down. But if you nail it, and Marvel has done it many times before, then we could be looking at something really special here with WandaVision. Stay tuned. Next week, we will find out even more answers, and I'm sure we're going to get any more questions. What did you think of this episode? Like I said, it is kind of a bridge between what happened last week to what's going on in the future. I think it did it in a really compelling way. What did you think? Let me know down below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. If you want to see even more of what I'm doing, you can check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. And please check out my podcast, All My Movies, which you can find on the Schmodown Entertainment Network and also on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you like to get your audio podcasts. We'd love to have you join us there as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.